This episode is part of the editorial season of Inside Illustration, a brand new suite of content brought to you by the Association of Illustrators. Here we explore the essential aspects of editorial illustration from both the commissioner and practitioner sides, examining the qualities that make excellent editorial images. Members of the AOI have exclusive access to the full range of content from the aoi.com/inside-illustration. Included here we have in-depth articles, resources, the opportunity to take part in a creative course on editorial illustration, and the full podcast episode. I'm your host, Rachel Emily Taylor, artist, writer, and course leader of BA Illustration at Camberwell College of Arts. Editorial illustration is a highly visible area of illustration, commissioned across print and digital platforms, encompassing a hugely diverse range of visual approaches and subject matter, from current affairs and portraiture to food and lifestyle. And today we're delighted to welcome two experienced voices from the editorial world. New York Times art director Curran Miller, who has been commissioning at the world-renowned newspaper for 25 years, and internationally commissioned illustrator Andre Cahuyu. They are joining us from the USA and Portugal. Here we've got some extracts from our podcast. As Andre has previously mentioned that at the beginning of his career, he only had one idea when he was commissioned, and that he developed a way of coming up with lots of ideas. I asked, are there any ways he'd recommend for young illustrators to develop those skills?
Well, I always remember what Dave Grohl from Nirvana and Foo Fighters said once about all these shows about X Factor and all these bands that have to be genius when they go on TV. And he said that if Nirvana had to go on one of these shows, they would never go through, because mostly what they did in the beginning was make noise in the garage, right? So you have to find a safe space to fail. Some of the most valuable lessons you learn are by failing, and of course not while working for the New York Times or someone else, Of course, it happened to me also. But I think you should try, you should fail, you should not be afraid to put yourself in a situation where you have to discover something that you didn't know. So you do personal projects, you practice at home, or you practice with fictitious assignments or something like that. And you try, and you practice. When you start doing that for a long time, you start coming up, one, with your style, because you find mistakes that actually work for you. And you start finding out that you can do it. You can do it in a way that it's yours, and it can be valuable in the future in a professional setting. So that would be my advice.
It's interesting that you said that, because as I have learned to be, I hope, a better art director than I was when I started, I've gotten better at selecting the different artists for the right projects and learning the steps and the communication skills that I need to share with the artist and what information I need to get from the editors, because sometimes I don't have a whole story to share. And so while you were talking about having, Andre, you mentioned having a broad knowledge of what's going on in the world. It's really important, I think, for artists to take a look at different websites and read different articles to see what's going on in the world, so you have a clue, and bring your personal experience without a strong opinion for what I need. And the more personal experience you put into it, usually the better it is. And for sure, I've had experiences where the artists have not succeeded, and I've had to pivot to somebody else in the last minute. So I try not to push it to the very last minute, although you get better at it and you find people who are fast, and you want the person that you've hired to do the job. But if it doesn't work out for a number of reasons, then it's good to have someone else in your back pocket. I don't go into a project with another person in my back pocket, but it is good to have faith in the person you've hired, but also be able to give them enough time to come up with their best idea. And if it's not working out, go to somebody else. And I have come back to people who haven't hit a home run the first time, but I have come back to that artist before because it was, maybe it just wasn't the right fit. Sometimes the match isn't right. And that's my fault. It's not the artist's fault. It's usually my fault when I've mismatched the artist to the piece.
I was also thinking about how encouraging up-and-coming illustrators. And Corinne, do you aim to encourage new illustrators? And how does commissioning them differ from commissioning more established practitioners?
Okay, well, that's a great question. And I love working with new people. But it depends on how much time I have. If I have a turnaround that's 24 hours, I'm going to go with a sure thing. I'm going to go with an artist that I know and have a relationship with, and I know what I'm going to get when I've given the assignment. I love to work with young, new artists, but I need to have time so that we have more time for back and forth. And I've had some great experiences with new artists for me that I haven't worked with, and also student artists. But I would typically assign them a smaller piece, like a one column illustration, just to try them out and then build on that. I also love to look at what other people are doing, other art directors, and what other magazines are doing and what other artists are doing. I just look around and I look at the other publications, I look at the artist websites, I get emails from people all the time. And I really do look at the emails. I used to get postcards, and that seemed a little bit more overwhelming because I have to actually open the envelope. Now I can just click on the email and look really quickly and an opening illustration on the email. And, that piece is really important to me because depending on that, I'll go to their website or I won't. I'll just delete the email. So if I find it offensive or something, I don't like the colors or there's too much animation that I just think I'm going to get a migraine or something, I just immediately delete that. So I hired this one guy. He just sent me an email and he said, "Hey, Miller." And I think he thought my first name was Miller. He was from another country. And so anyway, it was really fun. So we started, but I liked his work. So I wrote back, "Hey, and I hired him to do a couple of pieces and it worked out really well. So I come to artists in so many different ways, and I don't always know the experience level that they have when I'm coming to them. I mean, yes, I can go and do a deep dive into their websites and see. But I did have a young artist who did a piece for me, and she did a great job with the smaller illustrations. And then I gave her a cover, and I think it was just too much too fast. So I had to back off and go with somebody else. But she's an amazing artist, yeah.
I guess that links to what you were saying earlier about it has to be the right illustrator for the right job as well. So it's knowing when it's too big a project maybe for a young up-and-coming illustrator. So maybe they might need, do you think, more support with roughs to get to the final artwork?
Yeah, and more time. If we had more time, we could have gotten there. But I had to, again, I had to move on to somebody else just because of the deadline.
Mm-hmm. And Andre, thinking about your kind of early days and when you started out, has your practice and the way of working developed much since then?
Well, yeah. I started out drawing really well, and then I had to practice on having ideas. And that was a conscious decision to not just be a virtuoso craftsman of images. Like someone said, talking is not enough, you have to say something. So I thought that with each work, even if I'm not required to, I would have to find a specific point of view. I'll give you an example. I was working for a Portuguese newspaper and they didn't have the article. They just said, "Look, do something about intellectuals." And so about intellectuals, that's completely abstract. So you have to do a cover, it's about intellectuals, we don't have any more information to give you. So I started thinking, how should I process this? How should I do this? And I ended up doing an illustration with a man with a ball of wool. You know how do you say it? A ball of wool that a cat plays with inside his head, and all these threads extending to everything that was around him in the living room. So it's a kind of point of view of what an intellectual is. And he was looking at a cat playing with some wool. This kind of idea with visual analogies, like you take a brain is an amalgamation of something, and you go to the wool. Trying to brainstorm ideas, I had to practice a lot with these things and find a style of ideas also. I think it's not enough to find a graphic style. It's also a way of thinking of an image that it's part of your style. So that was what I had to work more parallel to working how to solve the visuals,
I was also interested, Andre, you were talking about motion work as well. Is motion work something that you've been developing? Is it time-consuming or a big commitment at kind of expanding that part of your practice?
Yeah, well, I'm from the generation that we did the transition from analog to digital. So for me, I was very hopeful of the digital and always thinking of new ways. I always thought the digital would bring new ways of communicating. Of course it did. And new ways of creating art. Of course it did. And for example, for the editorial illustration, for me it's always a conundrum how to adapt something that was made for print to a multimedia environment. I always thought that I could try to evolve the medium, like, for example, political cartooning. It should be animated, have sound. Voice work, it's too time-consuming, so maybe not voice work, but some people do it. I've identified two main ways to adapt illustration to multimedia. Either you animate it, or make a movie of it, or you do the process of building it. Like you film, you screen capture, you making the illustration. Also, people really like to watch the magic happen. So I try different approaches.
Karin, do you think motion work is something that's important for editorial right now, or a direction that it's going in?
Yes. I think right now, since most of the New York Times subscribers are online subscribers, there is an interest in doing subtle animation. And right now, we stopped doing GIFs, and now the files that we accept are movies or MOVs because they load faster and everything is about speed. Like if it doesn't load in 2 seconds, no one's going to stick around to watch it. But I think not all, but many of the illustrations online have subtle animation. And I think because of the technology, it's something people expect and want. And it does get a little more attention, to be honest. It's not always good, but I do think it can add a little extra.
It evolves with the platforms. For example, once Instagram introduced video in a loop, you can suddenly do loop animation. So if you can do loop animation, you can do a minimum of 3 seconds, and it loops like 10 cycles or something like that. So you don't have to do a movie, you don't have to be a movie producer or something like that. Sometimes you just animate a specific element of the image, or you build the image, or you do a sequence like a narrative sequence. There's lots of potential and possibilities. It's very interesting.
To continue listening to the full episode, head to theaoi.com/inside-illustration. Existing and new members of the AOI can access and enjoy the full range of content for the editorial season. The association is a UK-based organisation with members from all around the world who support illustrators across all areas of their professional lives, as well as staging events, campaigning, and running the annual World Illustration Awards. Thank you for listening.